Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin, and today we're going to do a comprehensive deep dive analysis of what a new Trump administration will mean for Ukraine and for Europe. Now, I have a bit of a disclaimer to make before I go on. One thing that this audience will not be aware of is that I have been a student and an analyst of the Trump phenomenon, MAGA and America First, for almost a decade. I was an analyst who predicted Trump's rise to the Republican nomination and ultimately the presidency, and published a book on Trump on the day of his inauguration in January of 2017. And thus, it's with some degree of credibility and authority that I talk about Trump and his thinking. And I feel compelled to do this because of the extraordinarily bad takes that I am seeing all around the world. This video is aimed primarily at decision makers, policymakers, elites, diplomats, people who have to prepare themselves for an incoming Trump administration, particularly when it comes to the issue of Ukraine. And I feel like I'm in a unique position to assist in that regard. Now, the first message is that things have changed since 2016. Why did Trump win in 2016? Well, it was the incompetence of America's elite. Ever since Vietnam, foreign policy has been one disaster after another. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, trade, to say nothing of immigration, and then all the problems domestically that is imported, opioid addiction, the exporting of jobs and manufacturing, and not only that, the preferential terms of trade given to China and the Communist Party not only exported millions of American jobs in the Midwest, but built up the strategic and military capability of America's only peer competitor in the world. America's foreign policy stewardship has been, for both parties, an absolute disaster. You would rate it an F, and if there was a grade you could give it below F, it would get that. America would have been a lot better off if they had done nothing over the past 50 years than the things that it in fact has done. And in the Republican primary, this is how Trump marketed himself: an outsider, a businessman, an insurgent, someone beyond the political elite. He would come in, he would drain the swamp and get America back on track. That was the message that he was giving to Republican voters, and the vast majority of them ate it up. I mean, I remember when he said to Jeb Bush right there on the debate stage that the Iraq war had been a catastrophe for the United States. Objectively, obviously true, but until that time, it was an unspoken thing. You could not possibly say that within the Republican Party. There was a consensus among the Republican elite about issues of domestic and foreign policy, and Trump came in and smashed that mold. And of course, in 2016, Trump did win by speaking directly to working class voters in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, flipping those states, those Rust Belt states that in the 80s and 90s had been firmly Democrat. But because the Democratic Party had become a coastal elite party, New York and California, it had forgotten how to address the needs and interests and aspirations of working class Americans. In fact, they started to talk down to them, seeing that their values no longer aligned with the classic American working class. My favorite graphic from the entire 2016 election is the New York State Republican primary. Donald Trump won every single congressional district in the state of New York except for one, his own. And why? It was the richest zip code in America. And yet after Trump won, both party elites came up with their own respective narratives as to why this occurred. For the Democratic Party, it was that Trump was a Russian stooge and that it was Russian misinformation, disinformation that had ultimately cost them the election, that Trump did not win legitimately. And they kept that narrative up for another 4 years until it all fell apart. For the Republicans, it was that Hillary Clinton was a uniquely bad candidate, distinctly unlikable candidate, and that anyone that the Republican Party put up would have therefore beaten her. Forgetting, of course, that Donald Trump had trounced all of their preferred candidates in the primary by a convincing margin. So both parties were totally wrong about why Trump was elected. So love Trump or hate him, and of course there's almost no political figure in the world more polarizing than Trump, he definitely won legitimately in the 2016 election. And the failure of the American elites to understand that, as well as elites from around the world, is what contributed to the malaise that exists today. And yet, despite his incredible campaign and convincing victory, Trump did make a catastrophic, fatal political error once he was elected. Trump wanted to be conciliatory. He wanted to be a deal maker. He chose Mike Pence as his VP, someone from the evangelical wing of the Republican Party, respected by the conservative and business class of the party. He was trying to bring everybody together. And then when he moved into the White House, he and his family saw Washington, D.C. and the civil service as neutral functionary elites who would carry out the business of the government as per Trump's agenda, even though Washington, D.C. voted 95% Democrat and has been partisan Democrat for many decades. He was thwarted on both counts. The civil service basically obstructed all of the America First foreign policy agenda, and diplomats from around the world found sympathetic ears within Trump's administration, people around Trump trying to manage him rather than effectively carry out the presidential will. In short, Trump's administration was largely paralyzed for 4 full years. And then after he left office, the primary goal of the Washington elite was that he would never run again. He was kicked off Twitter and a bunch of other social media platforms. He was prosecuted. There's a lot of legal cases brought against him. They tried very hard to ensure that Trump and all of his supporters would be locked out of the political process going forward. How that unfolded is an interesting story in itself. Of course, Elon Musk bought Twitter, now X, turned it into a free speech platform, re-enfranchised the Republican base, and far from knocking Trump out, all of these legal actions simply solidified support behind him, as his argument that Washington was controlled by this self-interested elite that was trying to use the corrupt institutions of the state to attack political opponents, whether you agree with him or not, certainly had currency among his base, who could see that Trump was being prosecuted even though he was no longer in office and was a political candidate. Well, why this long history lesson and preamble? Well, the key message here is that the tactics and strategy that was employed by foreign governments around the world during the Trump administration part 1 will not work in Trump administration part 2. Trump has learned his lesson here, and 2 major things have changed. Number 1, the Republican Party is firmly behind Trump, America First, MAGA. It's his party now. And we can see the evidence of that in his choice of running mate, J.D. Vance. He is not a conciliatory figure within the Republican Party. He's a firm acolyte of the America First MAGA Republicans. And thus, it is a passing of the torch, essentially, of Donald Trump to Vance, and basically a message to the rest of the Republican Party and the United States at large that the MAGA Republican agenda is now dominant. He does not need to be conciliatory with other members of the Republican establishment. He doesn't need to make nice with the business class, the evangelicals. The evangelicals will support Trump anyway because they see his survival of that atrocious attack as an act of God. And as for the aspirational hangers-on, they no longer see their path to power as being a never-Trumper or attaching themselves to the Cohen brothers. Rather, they see themselves as trying to get on the right side of Trump, his family, and the America First agenda. So the entire Republican establishment is now a Trump establishment. He's no longer an insider trying to break the system. He is the system. Secondly, is that the Heritage Foundation is also firmly behind Trump. The Heritage Foundation is America's primary conservative think tank, and they're running Project 2025. Of which the most important aspect is something called Schedule F. And that is the plan to replace the Washington Civil Service. It is the cleaning house of Washington, D.C. And when Trump is elected and takes office, those scores will be settled. There'll be a political night of long knives where thousands of agency figures who are perceived as being against the Trump agenda will be replaced by firm, loyalist Trump Republicans. It'll be a Trump establishment, not just within the Republican Party, but also the civil service and the agencies. Those agencies that are sought to thwart Trump's agenda, the State Department, the FBI, they are going to be brought to heel. So again, what this means is that political leaders, diplomats, allies will not be able to approach figures around Trump who are sympathetic to them. Those people will be replaced. In order to make headway with the American administration under Trump, you will need to talk their language and understand America First thinking. And that is possible to do to the advantage not only of your own national security and foreign policy interest, but also to situations like Ukraine. And I'll get into that now. But in order to do that, you have to understand what American foreign policy doctrine is, the thinking around it, and be able to pitch your arguments to a Trump administration that align with Trump thinking. So what is America First? Well, what it isn't is isolationism. It's not nativism. It's not xenophobia. What it is a realist foreign policy. It is an understanding that America's resources are finite, that it has a hierarchy of strategic priorities, and that resources should be aligned with the importance of those priorities. It is a rejection of American exceptionalism in the international order. It's based on the premise that there is a global system of nation states whose primary objective is survival and the maximization of its power. It perceives that power and interest are the most important influences in the global system, and that China is the main peer competitor of the United States within that system. Now, this view had always been a faction within the American foreign policy establishment, minor one. However, it had previously aligned with other more dominant areas of American foreign policy thinking, of idealism, of liberalism. And that's because during the Cold War, Europe was the most important strategic theater for the United States. So much so that if the Soviet Union had invaded Western Europe, the United States thought it worthwhile to initiate nuclear war to prevent that from happening. Europe and NATO were the linchpin of America's foreign policy thinking and its place in the world. And yet today, a larger number of people, and Trump Republicans in particular, view Europe to be of tertiary strategic importance to the United States. The primary number one goal is to prevent China from being the dominant power in Asia, because Asia is the engine of growth, both in terms of economy and population for the entire world. Secondly, there's the Middle East, where, of course, energy supplies are of critical importance. But then tertiary importance is Europe, because for whatever threat Russia poses to Ukraine, it is highly improbable that Russia is going to march all the way across Western Europe like it was a very real threat during the Soviet days. And yet this lack of understanding about what drives America First doctrine leads to some really difficult conversations where people are talking at cross purposes. People are accusing Trump of being a Putin stooge, that lover of autocrats, and that is not helpful to the discussion. If you want to persuade the Trump administration to support Ukraine, and I believe that is possible to do, you need to frame your arguments in American strategic interest. Now, there are some strategic arguments that have been put forward that are rejected by the Trump administration out of hand, and I can understand why. The first is that commitment to Ukraine deters China over Taiwan because it shows that America is committed to its allies. Well, the first issue is that Ukraine is not a military ally of the United States in the way that Taiwan and many East Asian allies are. And secondly, most Trump Republicans will say that what will deter China from invading Taiwan is serious military capability forward deployment towards Taiwan. By investing in submarines, long-range bombers, missiles, ships, demonstrates the strategic primacy that America gives to Taiwan and the Pacific, and America's commitment to going to war with China to defend it. Whereas if it's embroiled in Ukraine, distracted, that China is more, not less likely to invade Taiwan, while America is overcommitted. The second argument that gets rejected is that there aren't any real trade-offs. After all, Europe is a land theater. It relies on tanks and armies and artillery, while Taiwan is a maritime theater, which requires a different set of capabilities. Now, while that may have some currency in certain circles, their general view is that, well, HIMARS, missiles, rocketry, all of these things are spreading American inventories extremely thin, and that those same capabilities will be used in a porcupine strategy in defending Taiwan. So their thinking is that there is a trade-off by expending all of these resources in Ukraine, that you cannot expend those resources in Taiwan. A dollar spent here is a dollar that can't be spent elsewhere. And finally is the moral imperative that Putin, of course, is an expansionist dictator who invaded Ukraine in a completely unprovoked way, and that all Ukraine is trying to do is defend itself. Now, this gets a lot of sympathy among Americans generally, and is probably on an emotional level the primary reason why there is still fair support among the American electorate to support Ukraine. But then, of course, it becomes a question of priority. What about the Americans who are suffering, the southern border, or Haiti, which is a completely failed state? The point is that there are bad things happening all over the world, and America doesn't have the power like it did in the 90s to be everywhere all at once. Okay, so those are the arguments that do not have traction with the Trump people. What about the arguments that really do and can shift the needle? Well, the first is that by stopping Russia in Ukraine, it protects NATO. That it's pretty clear at this point that Vladimir Putin and the Russian elite generally would like to roll back NATO. They would expand into the Baltic countries if they could. And thus, if they're successful in Ukraine, it is highly probable that America will be dragged into a conflict in Europe anyhow, defending NATO. So of course, Trump Republicans would rather not spend all this money and equipment in Ukraine, but if it's the least expensive option, if it's what's going to future-proof NATO and stop Russia from expanding into NATO in a way that will drag America in to something they would much rather not be involved in, then that is a price worth paying. In other words, it's the least bad option from an America First strategic point of view. That does have serious weight in Trump circles. The second argument is that Russia is a strategic client of China, that Russia is helping China in all kinds of ways, politically, economically, and strategically with the transfer of all sorts of military technology, and therefore giving Russia and Putin a bloody nose in Ukraine sends a message that you're much better off trying to have a positive relationship with the United States, a message to Putin that he is wrong about the cultural weakness of the West and the malaise and division that is facing the United States, and actually that America can deal with Russia from a position of strength. Now, the end game of that would still be a peace deal in Ukraine, but it would be a peace deal that would be more favorable to the United States and ultimately to Ukraine than it would be to Russia and what Russia wants today. And the third argument, and this is where I think the Baltic countries and Poland really have to pat themselves on the back, and I applaud them from afar, is that some NATO allies are pulling their weight in the alliance. The biggest grievance that Trump Republicans have and his voters have are that there are freeloaders within Europe. Germany, France. It's absurd that these wealthy, powerful countries who are themselves significantly larger in economic size than Russia as a whole are being defended by the American troops and paid for by the American taxpayer. There are 30,000 American troops in Germany right now, carryover from the Cold War. That's absurd. That's totally moronic. Meanwhile, France isn't spending 2% of GDP. Most NATO allies aren't, but some are. And these are Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the UK, many others are stepping up now as well. Denmark has donated 6 billion euros to Ukraine. That's incredible given the size of the country. You compare that to Spain, which has donated less than $1 billion, and Spain, of course, is a bigger country. So, of course, there are some countries that have a lot of currency with the Trump Republicans. Trump will help allies that help themselves. Now, while there might be a sense of regret among some Trump Republicans that NATO expanded that far in the first place, they went right up to the Russian border, which from the Trump administration point of view kind of destabilized that region. I have a more complex take, but I can see why they think that. But the Trump leadership knows that we are where we are. NATO has expanded that far and that Russia needs to be deterred, particularly when the allies that are closest and most threatened to Russia are doing the most to support their own national defense, be good allies of the United States, and some are even helping with China. I mean, the currency, the political currency that Lithuania has among the Trump America First people is extraordinary. Lithuania took on China. This small country said, no, we're going to have a diplomatic relationship with Taiwan. We're going to have economic ties with Taiwan, and we're not going to let a communist dictatorship tell us who we can and cannot be friends with. We're going to support democracy, the rule of law, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and that has a lot of respect in Trump circles. Do not underestimate that, and my message to the Lithuanian government would be, don't squander it. Because what that does is it gives an example to the rest of Europe. The Trump leadership can use the Baltic countries, can use Poland with its strong border wall, its huge investment in its national defense, as a cudgel to hit over the head of those allies that should be pulling their weight but aren't. We're not going to find in 4 years' time 30,000 American troops in Germany, there will be an expectation that these countries normalize their military forces and take the leadership in Europe. And that brings me to the UK. And the UK is aware of this. During the Cold War, of course, the United Kingdom was America's most important strategic ally in the world, had an independent nuclear deterrent, and was a linchpin in NATO. And British prime ministers gained their prestige through their relationship with America's leaders, American presidents, i.e. the special relationship. And the UK has seen that slip away because America now has its strategic priorities elsewhere. Other allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, are more important to the United States today than the United Kingdom. So in order for the UK to maintain that special relationship, it needs to demonstrate to America's leaders, and Trump Republicans in particular, that it is guarding the flank. It is protecting NATO. It is taking the leadership role in positioning itself to deter Russia so that America can reposition itself in Asia. And therefore, the road to Washington, D.C. for most European allies is through Whitehall. The United Kingdom has a strong interest in being the primary strategic competitor to Russia in Europe, because as I said, that frees up the US elsewhere. Now, of course, the UK is also involved in Asia. It's supporting AUKUS. It'll have a primary role in providing Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. They're working together on AI and cyber warfare, all these things as well. But from a kinetic point of view, an overt military position point of view, while America will provide additional support, it will sit in the background. And thus, the important message here is that if all the NATO allies play their cards right, they don't go and antagonize the Trump Republicans, the MAGA base. They continue to be respectful of the American leadership and try to understand where the Trump Republicans are coming from. You will get most of what you want when it comes to issues like Ukraine and your own national defense and security. Exactly how that will look from a Trump point of view, I will discuss in another video. But hopefully this analysis is educative in terms of what America First thinking is. It's not isolationism, it is realism, and how to pitch your arguments to a Trump administration within that context. It provides a framework, and hopefully for your own government, for your diplomatic corps, for your military establishment, you'll be able to take some of these messages on board. Now, that's all for today. I would love to hear your thoughts and comments down below. Just be respectful about it, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.